Chapter 11. The Brave Preserver. I could have wished, during the next few days, that Mr. Harry Hawkes's attitude towards myself had not been so unctuously confidential and mysterious. It was unnecessary, in my opinion, for him to grin meaningly when we met in the street. His sly wink when we passed each other on the cob struck me as an indifferent taste. The thing had been definitely arranged. 10 shillings down, and 10 when it was over, and there was no need for any cloak and dark lantern effects. I objected strongly to being treated as the villain of a melodrama. I was merely an ordinary well-meaning man, forced by circumstances into doing the work of Providence. Mr. Hawkes's demeanour seemed to say, "We are two reckless scoundrels, but bless you, I won't give away your guilty secret." The climax came one morning as I was going along the street towards the beach. I was passing a dark doorway, when out shimmered Mr. Hawke as if he had been a spectre instead of the most substantial man within a radius of 10 miles. "St!" he whispered. "Now look here, Hawke," I said wrathfully, for the start he had given me had made me bite my tongue. "This has got to stop. I refuse to be haunted in this way. What is it now?" "Mr. Derrick goes out this morning, sir." "Thank goodness for that," I said. "Get it over this morning, then, without fail. I couldn't stand another day of it." I went on to the cob, where I sat down. I was excited. Deeds of great import must shortly be done. I felt a little nervous. It would never do to bungle the thing. Suppose by some accident I were to drown the professor? Or suppose that, after all, he contented himself with a mere formal expression of thanks, and refused to let bygones be bygones? These things did not bear thinking of. I got up and began to pace restlessly to and fro. Presently, from the farther end of the harbour, there put off Mr. Hawkes's boat, bearing its precious cargo. My mouth became dry with excitement. Very slowly Mr. Hawke pulled round the end of the cob, coming to a standstill some dozen yards from where I was performing my beat. It was evidently here that the scene of the gallant rescue had been fixed. My eyes were glued upon Mr. Hawkes's broad back. Only when going in to bat at cricket have I experienced a similar feeling of suspense. The boat lay almost motionless on the water. I had never seen the sea smoother. Little ripples plashed against the side of the cob. It seemed as if this perfect calm might continue forever. Mr. Hawke made no movement. Then suddenly the whole scene changed to one of vast activity. I heard Mr. Hawke utter a hoarse cry, and saw him plunge violently in his seat. The professor turned half round, and I caught sight of his indignant face, pink with emotion. Then the scene changed again with the rapidity of a dissolving view. I saw Mr. Hawke give another plunge, and the next moment the boat was upside down in the water, and I was shooting head foremost to the bottom, oppressed with the indescribable clammy sensation which comes when one's clothes are thoroughly wet. I rose to the surface close to the upturned boat. The first sight I saw was the sputtering face of Mr. Hawke. I ignored him, and swam to where the professor's head bobbed on the waters. "Keep cool," I said. A silly remark in the circumstances. He was swimming energetically but unskilfully. He appeared to be one of those men who can look after themselves in the water only when they are in a bathing costume. In his shore clothes, it would have taken him a week to struggle to land, if he got there at all, which was unlikely. I knew all about saving people from drowning. We used to practice it with a dummy in the swimming bath at school. I attacked him from the rear, and got a good grip of him by the shoulders. I then swam on my back in the direction of land, and beached him with much éclat at the feet of an admiring crowd. I had thought of putting him under once or twice, just to show him he was being rescued, but decided against such a course as needlessly realistic. As it was, I fancy he had swallowed of sea-water 2 or 3 hearty draughts. The crowd was enthusiastic. "Brave young feller," said somebody. I blushed. This was fame. "Jumped in, he did, sure enough, and saved the gentleman. Be the old soul drownded? That girt fool, Harry Hawke." I was sorry for Mr. Hawke. Popular opinion was against him. What the professor said of him, when he recovered his breath, I cannot repeat. Not because I do not remember it, but because there is a line, and one must draw it. Let it be sufficient to say that on the subject of Mr. Hawke, he saw eye to eye with the citizen who described him as a girt fool. I could not help thinking that my fellow conspirator did well to keep out of it all. He was now sitting in the boat, which he had restored to its normal position, bailing pensively with an old tin can. To satire from the shore he paid no attention. The professor stood up and stretched out his hand. I grasped it. "Mr. Garnet," he said, for all the world as if he had been the father of the heroine of Hilda's hero, "we parted recently in anger. Let me thank you for your gallant conduct, and hope that bygones would be bygones." I came out strong. I continued to hold his hand. The crowd raised a sympathetic cheer. I said, "Professor, the fault was mine. Show that you have forgiven me by coming up to the farm and putting on something dry." "An excellent idea, me boy. I am a little wet." "A little," I agreed. We walked briskly up the hill to the farm. Eucridge met us at the gate. He diagnosed the situation rapidly. "You're all wet," he said. I admitted it. "Professor Derrick has had an unfortunate boating accident," I explained. "And Mr. Garnet heroically dived in all his clothes, and saved me life," broke in the professor. "A hero, sir. Achoo!" "You're catching cold, old horse," said Eucridge, all friendliness and concern, his little differences with the professor having vanished like thawed snow. "This'll never do. Come upstairs and get into something of Garnet's. My own toggery wouldn't fit, what? Come along, I'll get you some hot water. Mrs. Beale, we want a large can of hot water, at once." "What?" "Yes, immediately." "What?" "Very well, then, as soon as you can. Now then, Garney, my boy, out with the duds. What do you think of this now, Professor? A sweet pretty thing in grey flannel. Here's a shirt. Get out of that wet toggery, and Mrs. Beale shall dry it. Don't attempt to tell me about it till you're changed. Socks forward. Show socks. Here you are. Coat. Try this blazer. That's right. He bustled about till the professor was clothed, then marched him downstairs and gave him a cigar. "Now, what's all this? What happened?" The professor explained. He was severe in his narration upon the unlucky Mr. Hawke. "I was fishing, Mr. Eucridge, with me back turned, when I felt the boat rock violently from one side to the other, to such an extent that I nearly lost me equilibrium, and then the boat upset. The man's a fool, sir. I could not see what had happened, my back being turned, as I say." "Garnet must have seen. What happened, old horse?" "It was very sudden," I said. "It seemed to me as if the man had got an attack of cramp. That would account for it. He has the reputation of being a most sober and trustworthy fellow." "Never trust that sort of man," said Eucridge. "They are always the worst. It's plain to me that this man was beastly drunk, and upset the boat while trying to do a dance." "A great curse, drink," said the professor. "Why, yes, Mr. Eucridge, I think I will, thank you. That will be enough. Not all the soda, if you please. Ah, this tastes pleasanter than salt water, Mr. Garnet, eh? Ha ha!" He was in the best of tempers, and I worked strenuously to keep him so. My scheme had been so successful that its iniquity did not worry me. I have noticed that this is usually the case in matters of this kind. It is the bungled crime that brings remorse. "We must go round the links together one of these days, Mr. Garnet," said the Professor. "I have noticed you there on several occasions, playing a strong game. I have lately taken to using a wooden putter. It is wonderful what a difference it makes." Golf is a great bond of union. We wandered about the grounds, discussing the game, the entente cordiale growing more firmly established every moment. "We must certainly arrange a meeting," concluded the Professor. "I shall be interested to see how we stand with regard to one another. I have improved my game considerably since I've been down here, considerably." "My only feat worthy of mention since I started the game," I said, "has been to have a round with Angus McLurkin at St. Andrews." "The McLurkin?" asked the Professor, impressed. "Yes, but it was one of his very off days, I fancy. He must have had gout or something. And I have certainly never played so well since." "Still," said the Professor. "Yes, we must really arrange to meet." With Eucridge, who was in one of his less tactless moods, he became very friendly. Eucridge's ready agreement with his strictures on the erring hawk had a great deal to do with this. When a man has a grievance, he feels drawn to those who will hear him patiently and sympathize. Eucridge was all sympathy. "The man is an unprincipled scoundrel," he said, "and should be torn limb from limb. Take my advice, and don't go out with him again. Show him that you are not a man to be trifled with. The spilt child dreads the water, what? Human life isn't safe with such men as Hawk roaming about." "You are perfectly right, sir. The man can have no defence. I shall not employ him again." I felt more than a little guilty while listening to this duet on the subject of the man whom I had lured from the straight and narrow path. But the Professor would listen to no defence. My attempts at excusing him were ill received. Indeed, the Professor shewed such signs of becoming heated that I abandoned my fellow conspirator to his fate with extreme promptness. After all, an addition to the stipulated reward, one of these days, would compensate him for any loss which he might sustain from the withdrawal of the Professor's custom. Mr. Harry Hawk was in good enough case. I would see that he did not suffer. Filled with these philanthropic feelings, I turned once more to talk with the Professor of niblicks and approach shots and holes done in 3 without a brassey. We were a merry party at lunch, a lunch, fortunately, in Mrs. Beale's best vein, consisting of a roast chicken and sweets. Chicken had figured somewhat frequently of late on our daily bill of fare. We saw the Professor off the premises in his dried clothes, and I turned back to put the fowls to bed in a happier frame of mind than I had known for a long time. I whistled ragtime airs as I worked. "Rum, old buffer," said Eucridge meditatively, pouring himself out another whiskey and soda. "My goodness, I should have liked to have seen him in the water. Why do I miss these good things?" Chapter 12. Some Emotions and Yellow Lupin. The fame which came to me through that gallant rescue was a little embarrassing. I was a marked man. Did I walk through the village, heads emerged from windows, and eyes followed me out of sight. Did I sit on the beach, groups formed behind me and watched in silent admiration. I was the man of the moment. "If we'd wanted an advertisement for the farm," said Eucridge on one of these occasions, "we couldn't have had a better one than you, Garney, my boy. You have brought us 3 distinct orders for eggs during the last week. And I'll tell you what it is. We need all the orders we can get that'll bring us in ready money. The farm is in a critical condition. The coffers are low, deuced low. I'll tell you another thing. I'm getting precious tired of living on nothing but chicken and eggs. So's Milly, though she doesn't say so." "So am I," said, "and I don't feel like imitating your wife's proud reserve. I never want to see a chicken again. As for eggs, they are far too much for us." For the last week, monotony had been the keynote of our commissariat. We had had cold chicken and eggs for breakfast, boiled chicken and eggs for lunch, and roast chicken and eggs for dinner. Meals became a nuisance, and Mrs. Beale complained bitterly that we did not give her a chance. She was a cook who would have graced an alderman's house and served up noble dinners for gourmets, and here she was in this remote corner of the world, ringing the changes on boiled chicken and roast chicken and boiled eggs and poached eggs. Mr. Whistler, set to paint signboards for public houses, might have felt the same restless discontent. As for her husband, the hired retainer, he took life as tranquilly as ever, and seemed to regard the whole thing as the most exhilarating farce he had ever been in. I think he looked on Eucridge as an amiable lunatic, and was content to rough it a little in order to enjoy the privilege of observing his movements. He made no complaints of the food. When a man has supported life for a number of years on incessant army beef, the monotony of daily chicken and eggs scarcely strikes him. "The fact is," said Eucridge, "these tradesmen round here seem to be a sordid, suspicious lot. They clamour for money." He mentioned a few examples. Vickers, the butcher, had been the first to strike, with the remark that he would like to see the colour of Mr. Eucridge's money before supplying further joints. Dawlish, the grocer, had expressed almost exactly similar sentiments 2 days later, and the ranks of these passive resistors had been receiving fresh recruits ever since. To a man, the tradesmen of Combe Regis seemed as deficient in simple faith as they were in Norman blood. "Can't you pay some of them a little on account?" I suggested. "It would set them going again." "My dear old man," said Eucridge impressively, "we need every penny of ready money we can raise for the farm. The place simply eats money. That infernal Roop let us in for I don't know what." That insidious epidemic had indeed proved costly. We had painted the throats of the chickens with the best turpentine, at least Eucridge and Beale had, but in spite of their efforts, dozens had died, and we had been obliged to sink much more money than was pleasant in restocking the run. The battle which took place on the first day after the election of the new members was a sight to remember. The results of it were still noticeable in the depressed aspect of certain of the recently enrolled. "No," said Eucridge, summing up, "these men must wait. We can't help their troubles. Why, good gracious, it isn't as if they've been waiting for the money long. We've not been down here much over a month. I never heard of such a scandalous thing. 'Pon my word, I've a good mind to go round and have a straight talk with one or two of them. I come and settle down here, and stimulate trade, and give them large orders, and they worry me with bills when they know I'm up to my eyes in work looking after the fowls. One can't attend to everything. The business is just now at its most crucial point. It would be fatal to pay any attention to anything else with things as they are. These scoundrels will get paid all in good time." It is a peculiarity of situations of this kind that the ideas of debtor and creditor as to what constitutes a good time never coincide. I am afraid that, despite the urgent need for strict attention to business, I was inclined to neglect my duties about this time. I had got into the habit of wandering off, either to the links, where I generally found the professor, sometimes Phyllis, or on long walks by myself. There was one particular walk along the cliffs, through some of the most beautiful scenery I have ever set eyes on, which more than any other suited my mood. I would work my way through the woods till I came to a small clearing on the very edge of the cliff. There I would sit and smoke by the hour. If ever I am stricken with smoker's heart, or staggers, or tobacco amblyopia, or any other of the cheery things which doctors predict for the devotee of the weed, I shall feel that I sowed the seeds of it that summer in that little clearing overlooking the sea. A man in love needs much tobacco. A man thinking out a novel needs much tobacco. I was in the grip of both maladies. Somehow I found that my ideas flowed more readily in that spot than in any other. I had not been inside the professor's grounds since the occasion when I had gone in through the boxwood hedge. But on the afternoon following my financial conversation with Eucridge, I made my way thither, after a toilet which, from its length, should have produced better results than it did. Not for 4 whole days had I caught so much as a glimpse of Phyllis. I had been to the links 3 times, and had met the professor twice, but on both occasions she had been absent. I had not the courage to ask after her. I had an absurd idea that my voice or my manner would betray me in some way. I felt that I should have put the question with such an exaggerated show of indifference that all would have been discovered. The professor was not at home, nor was Mr. Chase, nor was Miss Nora Derrick, the lady I'd met on the beach with the professor. Miss Phyllis, said the maid, was in the garden. I went into the garden. She was sitting under the cedar by the tennis lawn, reading. She looked up as I approached. I said it was a lovely afternoon, after which there was a lull in the conversation. I was filled with a horrid fear that I was boring her. I had probably arrived at the very moment when she was most interested in her book. She must, I thought, even now be regarding me as a nuisance, and was probably rehearsing bitter things to say to the maid for not having had the sense to explain that she was out. "I called in the hope of seeing Professor Derrick," I said. "You will find him on the links," she replied. It seemed to me that she spoke wistfully. "Oh, it doesn't matter," I said. "It wasn't anything important." This was true. If the professor had appeared then and there, I should have found it difficult to think of anything to say to him which would have accounted to any extent for my anxiety to see him. "How are the chickens, Mr. Garnet?" said she. The situation was saved. Conversationally, I am like a clockwork toy. I have to be set going. On the affairs of the farm I could speak fluently. I sketched for her the progress we had made since her visit. I was humorous concerning Roop, epigrammatic on the subject of hired retainer and Edwin. "Then the cat did come down from the chimney?" said Phyllis. We both laughed, and, I can answer for myself, I felt the better for it. "He came down the next day," I said, "and made an excellent lunch of one of our best fowls. He also killed another, and only just escaped death himself at the hands of Eucridge." "Mr. Eucridge doesn't like him, does he?" "If he does, he dissembles his love. Edwin is Mrs. Eucridge's pet. He is the only subject on which they disagree. Edwin is certainly in the way on a chicken farm. He has got over his fear of Bob, and is now perfectly lawless. We have to keep a steady eye on him." "And have you had any success with the incubator? I love incubators. I have always wanted to have one of my own, but we have never kept fowls." "The incubator has not done all that it should have done," I said. "Eucridge looks after it, and I fancy his methods are not the right methods. I don't know if I've got the figures absolutely correct, but Eucridge reasons on these lines. He says you are supposed to keep the temperature up to 105 degrees. I think he said 105. Then the eggs are supposed to hatch in a week or so. He argues that you may just as well keep the temperature at 72 and wait a fortnight for your chickens. I am certain there's a fallacy in the system somewhere, because we never seem to get as far as the chickens. But Eucridge says his theory is mathematically sound, and he sticks to it." "Are you quite sure that the way you are doing it is the best way to manage a chicken farm?" "I should very much doubt it. I am a child in these matters. I had only seen a chicken in its wild state once or twice before we came down here. I had never dreamed of being an active assistant on a real farm. The whole thing began like Mr. George Ade's Fable of the Author. An author, myself, was sitting at his desk trying to turn out any old thing that could be converted into breakfast food, when a friend came in and sat down on the table, and told him to go right on and not mind him. "Did Mr. Eucridge do that?" "Very nearly that. He called at my rooms one beautiful morning when I was feeling desperately tired of London and overworked and dying for a holiday, and suggested that I should come to Combe Regis with him and help him farm chickens. I have not regretted it." "It's a lovely place, isn't it?" "The loveliest I have ever seen. How charming your garden is." "Shall we go and look at it? You have not seen the whole of it." As she rose, I saw her book, which she had laid face downwards on the grass beside her. It was the same much-enduring copy of The Manoeuvres of Arthur. I was thrilled. This patient perseverance must surely mean something. She saw me looking at it. "Did you draw Pamela from anybody?" she asked suddenly. I was glad now that I had not done so. The wretched Pamela, once my pride, was for some reason unpopular with the only critic about whose opinion I cared, and had fallen accordingly from her pedestal. As we wandered down from the garden path, she gave me her opinion of the book. In the main, it was appreciative. I shall always associate the scent of yellow lupin with the higher criticism. "Of course, I don't know anything about writing books," she said. "Yes," my tone implied, or I hope it did, that she was an expert on books, and that if she was not, it didn't matter. "But I don't think you do your heroines well. I have just got The Outsider." My other novel, Bastable and Kirby, 6 shillings, satirical, all about society, of which I know less than I know about chicken farming. Slated by Times and Spectator. Well received by London Mail and Winning Post. "And," continued Phyllis, "Lady Maud is exactly the same as Pamela in The Manoeuvres of Arthur. I thought you must have drawn both characters from someone you knew." "No," I said, "no, purely imaginary." "I am so glad," said Phyllis. And then neither of us seemed to have anything to say. My knees began to tremble. I realized that the moment had arrived when my fate must be put to the touch. And I feared that the moment was premature. We cannot arrange these things to suit ourselves. I know that the time was not yet ripe, but the magic scent of the yellow lupin was too much for me. "Miss Derrick," I said hoarsely. Phyllis was looking with more intentness than the attractions of the flower justified at a rose she held in her hand. The bee hummed in the lupin. "Miss Derrick," I said, and stopped again. "I say, you people," said a cheerful voice, "tea is ready. Hello, Garnet, how are you? That medal arrived yet from the Humane Society?" I spun around. Mr. Tom Chase was standing at the end of the path. The only word that could deal adequately with the situation slapped against my front teeth. I grinned a sickly grin. "Well, Tom," said Phyllis. And there was, I thought, just the faintest tinkle of annoyance in her voice. "I've been bathing," said Mr. Chase, apropos de botte. "Oh," I replied. "And I wish," I added, "that you'd drowned yourself." But I added it silently to myself. Chapter 13. Tea and Tennis. "Met the professor's late boatman on the Cobb," said Mr. Chase, dissecting a chocolate cake. "Clumsy man," said Phyllis. "I hope he was ashamed of himself. I shall never forgive him for trying to drown Papa." My heart bled for Mr. Henry Hawke, that modern martyr. "When I met him," said Tom Chase, "he looked as if he had been trying to drown his sorrow as well." "I knew he drank," said Phyllis severely. "The very first time I saw him." "You might have warned the professor," murmured Mr. Chase. "He couldn't have upset the boat if he had been sober." "You never know. He may have done it on purpose." "Tom, how absurd." "Rather rough on the man, aren't you?" I said. "Merely a suggestion," continued Mr. Chase airily. "I've been reading sensational novels lately, and it seems to me that Mr. Hawks cut out to be a minion. Probably some secret foe of the professor's bribed him." My heart stood still. Did he know, I wondered, and was this all a roundabout way of telling me he knew? "The professor may be a member of an anarchist league or something, and this is punishment for refusing to assassinate some sportsman." "Have another cup of tea, Tom, and stop talking nonsense." Mr. Chase handed in his cup. "What gave me the idea that the upset was done on purpose was this. I saw the whole thing from the Wear Cliff. The spill looked to me just like dozens I had seen at Malta." "Why do they upset themselves on purpose at Malta particularly?" inquired Phyllis. "Listen carefully, my dear, and you'll know more about the ways of the Navy that guards your coast than you did before. When men are allowed on shore at Malta, the owner has a fancy to see them snugly on board again at a certain reasonable hour. After that hour, any Maltese policeman who brings them aboard gets 1 sovereign, cash. But he has to do all the bringing part of it on his own. Consequence is, you see, boats rowing out to the ship carrying men who have overstayed their leave. And when they get near enough, the able-bodied gentleman in custody jumps to his feet, upsets the boat, and swims for the gangway. The policemen, if they aren't drowned, they sometimes are, race him, and whichever gets there first wins. If it's the policeman, he gets his sovereign. If it's the sailor, he is considered to have arrived not in a state of custody and gets off easier." What a judicious remark that was of the governor of North Carolina to the governor of South Carolina respecting the length of time between drinks. "Just one more cup, please, Phyllis." "But how does all that apply?" I asked, dry-mouthed. "Mr. Hawk upset the professor just as those Maltese were upset. There's a patent way of doing it. Furthermore, by judicious questioning, I found that Hawk was once in the Navy and stationed at Malta. Now, who's going to drag in Sherlock Holmes?" "You don't really think," I said, feeling like a criminal in the dock when the case is going against him. "I think friend Hawk has been reenacting the joys of his vanished youth, so to speak." "He ought to be prosecuted," said Phyllis, blazing with indignation. "Alas, poor Hawk." "Nobody's safe with a man of that sort hiring out a boat." "Oh, miserable Hawk." "But why on earth should he play a trick like that on Professor Derrick, Chase?" "Pure animal spirits, probably. Or he may, as I say, be a minion." I was hot all over. "I shall tell Father that," said Phyllis in her most decided voice, "and see what he says. I don't wonder at the man taking to drink after doing such a thing." I think you're making a mistake," I said. "I never make mistakes," Mr. Chase replied. "I am called Archibald the All-Right, for I am infallible. I propose to keep a reflective eye upon the jovial Hawk." He helped himself to another section of the chocolate cake. "Haven't you finished yet, Tom?" inquired Phyllis. "I'm sure Mr. Garnett's getting tired of sitting talking here," she said. I shot out a polite negative. Mr. Chase explained with his mouth full that he had by no means finished. Chocolate cake, it appeared, was the dream of his life. When at sea, he was accustomed to lie awake o' nights thinking of it. "You don't seem to realize," he said, "that I have just come from a cruise on a torpedo boat. There was such a sea on as a rule that cooking operations were entirely suspended, and we lived on ham and sardines, without bread." "How horrible!" "On the other hand," added Mr. Chase philosophically, It didn't matter much, because we were all ill most of the time."
"Don't be nasty, Tom."
"I was merely defending myself. I hope Mr. Hawke will be able to do as well when his turn comes. My aim, my dear Phyllis, is to show you in a series of impressionist pictures the sort of thing I have to go through when I'm not here. Then perhaps you won't rend me so savagely over a matter of 5 minutes' lateness for breakfast."
5 minutes? It was 3/4 of an hour, and everything was simply frozen.
"Quite right, too, in weather like this. You're a slave to convention, Phyllis. You think breakfast ought to be hot, so you always have it hot. On occasion I prefer mine cold. Mine is the truer wisdom. You can give the cook my compliments, Phyllis, and tell her, gently, for I don't wish the glad news to overwhelm her, that I enjoyed the cake. Say that I shall be glad to hear from her again. Care for a game of tennis, Garnet?"
"What a pity Nora isn't here," said Phyllis. "We could have had a 4.
"But she is at present wasting her sweetness on the desert air of Yeovil. You had better sit down and watch us, Phyllis. Tennis in this sort of weather is no job for the delicately nurtured feminine. I will explain the finer points of my game as we go on. Look out particularly for the Tilden backhanded slosh, a winner every time." We proceeded to the tennis court. I played with the sun in my eyes. I might, if I chose, emphasize that fact and attribute my subsequent rout to it, adding, by way of solidifying the excuse, that I was playing on a strange court with a borrowed racket, and that my mind was preoccupied, firstly with l'affaire Hawke, secondly, and chiefly, with the gloomily thought that Phyllis and my opponent seemed to be on friendly terms with each other. Their manner at tea had been almost that of an engaged couple. There was a thorough understanding between them. I will not, however, take refuge behind excuses. I admit, without qualifying the statement, that Mr. Chase was too good for me. I had always been under the impression that lieutenants in the Royal Navy were not brilliant at tennis. I had met them at various houses, and they had never shone conspicuously. They had played an earnest, unobtrusive game, and generally seemed glad when it was over. Mr. Chase was not of this sort. His service was bottled lightning. His returns behaved like jumping crackers. He won the first game in precisely 6 strokes. He served. Only once did I take the service with the full face of the racket, and then I seemed to be stopping a bullet. I returned it into the net. The last of the series struck the wooden edge of my racket and soared over the back net into the shrubbery, after the manner of a snick to long slip off a fast bowler. "Game," said Mr. Chase. "We'll look for that afterwards." I felt a worm and no man. Phyllis, I thought, would probably judge my entire character from this exhibition. A man, she would reflect, who could be so feeble and miserable a failure at tennis could not be good for much in any department of life. She would compare me instinctively with my opponent, and contrast his dash and brilliance with my own inefficiency. Somehow the massacre was beginning to have a bad effect on my character. All my self-respect was ebbing. A little more of this, and I should become crushed, a mere human jelly. It was my turn to serve. Service is my strong point at tennis. I am inaccurate but vigorous, and occasionally send in a quite unplayable shot. 1 or 2 of these, even at the expense of a fault or so, and I might be permitted to retain at least a portion of my self-respect. I opened with a couple of faults. The sight of Phyllis, sitting calm and cool in her chair under the cedar, unnerved me. I served another fault, and yet another. "Here, I say, Garnet," observed Mr. Chase plaintively. "Do put me out of this hideous suspense. I'm becoming a mere bundle of quivering ganglions." I loathe facetiousness in moments of stress. I frowned austerely, made no reply, and served another fault, my 5th.
matters had reached a crisis. Even if I had to lob it underhand, I must send the ball over the net with the next stroke. I restrained myself this time, eschewing the careless vigor which had marked my previous efforts. The ball flew in a slow semicircle and pitched inside the correct court. At least, I told myself, I had not served a fault. What happened then, I cannot exactly say. I saw my opponent spring forward like a panther and whirl his racket. The next moment, the back net was shaking violently, and the ball was rolling swiftly along the ground on a return journey to the other court. "Love 40, said Mr. Chase. "Phyllis." "Yes." "That was the Tilden slosh." "I thought it must be," said Phyllis. In the third game, I managed to score 15. By the merest chance, I returned one of his red-hot serves, and, probably through surprise, he failed to send it back again. In the fourth and fifth games, I omitted to score. Phyllis had left the cedar now, and was picking flowers from the beds behind the court. We began the sixth game, and now, for some reason, I played really well. I struck a little vein of brilliance. I was serving, and this time a proportion of my serves went over the net instead of trying to get through. The score went from 15 all to 40-15. Hope began to surge through my veins. If I could keep this up, I might win yet. The Tilden slosh diminished my lead by 15. Then I got in a really fine serve, which beat him. Vantage in, another slosh. Deuce, another slam. Vantage out. It was an awesome moment. There was a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken by the flood, I served. Fault. I served again. A beauty. He returned it like a flash into the corner of the court. With a supreme effort, I got to it. We rallied. I was playing like a professor. Then whiz! The slosh had beaten me on the post. "Game end," said Mr. Chase, tossing his racket into the air and catching it by the handle. "Good game, that last one." I turned to see what Phyllis thought of it. At the 11th hour I had shown her of what stuff I was made. She had disappeared. "Looking for Miss Derrick," said Chase, jumping the net and joining me in my court. "She's gone into the house." "When did she go?" "At the end of the fifth game," said Chase. "Gone to dress for dinner, I suppose," he continued. "It must be getting late. I think I ought to be going too, if you don't mind. The professor gets a little restive if I keep him waiting for his daily bread." "Great Scott! That watch can't be right. What do you make of it?" "Yes, so do I. I really think I must run. You won't mind. Good night, then. See you tomorrow, I hope." I walked slowly out across the fields. That same star, in which I had confided on a former occasion, was at its post. It looked placid and cheerful. It never got beaten by 6 games to love under the very eyes of a lady star. It was never cut out ignominiously by infernally capable lieutenants in His Majesty's Navy. No wonder it was cheerful. Chapter 14. A Council of War. "The fact is," said Ugridge, "if things go on as they are now, my lad, we shall be in the cart. This business wants bucking up. We don't seem to be making any headway. Why it is, I don't know, but we are not making headway. Of course, what we want is time. If only these scoundrels of tradesmen would leave us alone for a spell, we could get things going properly. But we're hampered and rattled and worried all the time, aren't we, Milly?" "Yes, dear." "You don't let me see the financial side of the thing enough," I complained. "Why don't you keep me thoroughly posted? I didn't know we were in such a bad way. The fowls look fit enough, and Edwin hasn't had one for a week." "Edwin knows as well as possible when he's done wrong, Mr. Garnet,"
said Mrs. Ukridge. "He was so sorry after he had killed those other two."
"Yes," said Ukridge, "I saw to that." "As far as I can see," I continued, "we are going strong. Chicken for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is a shade monotonous, perhaps, but look at the business we're doing. We sold a whole heap of eggs last week."
"But not enough, Garney, old man. We aren't making our presence felt. England isn't ringing with our name. We sell a dozen eggs where we ought to be selling them by the 100, carting them off in trucks for the London market and congesting the traffic. Harrods and Whiteleys and the rest of them are beginning to get on their hind legs and talk. That's what they're doing. Devilish unpleasant they're making themselves. You see, laddie, there's no denying it. We did touch them for the deuce of a lot of things on account, and they agreed to take it out in eggs. All they've done so far is to take it out in apologetic letters from Milly. Now, I don't suppose there's a woman alive who can write a better apologetic letter than her nibs, but if you're broad-minded and can face facts, you can't help seeing that the juiciest apologetic letter is not an egg. I meant to say, look at it from their point of view. Harrod, or Whiteley, comes into his store in the morning, rubbing his hands expectantly. 'Well,' he says, 'how many eggs from Combe Regis today?' And instead of leading him off to a corner piled up with bursting crates, they show him a 4-page letter telling him it'll all come right in the future. I've never run a store myself, but I should think that would jar a chap. Anyhow, the blighters seem to be getting tired of waiting." "The last letter from Harrods was quite pathetic," said Mrs. Ukridge sadly. "I had a vision of an eggless London. I seemed to see homes rendered desolate, and lives embittered by the slump, and millionaires bidding against one another for the few rare specimens which Ukridge had actually managed to dispatch to Brompton and Bayswater. Ukridge, having induced himself to be broad-minded for 5 minutes, now began to slip back to his own personal point of view and became once more the man with a grievance. His fleeting sympathy with the wrongs of Mr. Harrod and Mr. Whiteley disappeared. "What it all amounts to," he said complainingly, "is that they're infernally unreasonable. I've done everything possible to meet them. Nothing could have been more manly and straightforward than my attitude. I told them in my last letter but 3 that I proposed to let them have the eggs on the Times installment system, and they said I was frivolous. They said that to send 13 eggs as payment for goods supplied to the value of £25 1 shilling 8½d was mere trifling. Trifling, I'll trouble you. That's the spirit in which they meet my suggestions. It was Harrod who did that. I've never met Harrod personally, but I'd like to, just to ask him if that's his idea of cementing amiable business relations. He knows just as well as anyone else that without credit, commerce has no elasticity. It's an elementary rule. I'll bet he'd have been sick if chappies had refused to let him have tick when he was starting his store. Do you suppose Harrod, when he started in business, paid cash down on the nail for everything? Not a bit of it. He went about taking people by the coat button and asking them to be good chaps and wait till Wednesday week. Trifling. Why, those 13 eggs were absolutely all we had over after Mrs. Beale had taken what she wanted for the kitchen. As a matter of fact, if it's anybody's fault, it's Mrs. Beale's. That woman literally eats eggs." "The habit is not confined to her," I said. "Well, what I mean to say is, she seems to bathe in them." "She says she needs so many for puddings, dear," said Mrs. Ukridge. "I spoke to her about it yesterday, and, of course, we often have omelettes." "She can't make omelettes without breaking eggs," I urged. "She can't make them without breaking us, damn it," said Ukridge. "1 or 2 more omelettes, and we're done for. No fortune on earth could stand it. We mustn't have any more omelettes, Milly. We must economize.
Millions of people get on all right without omelets. I suppose there are families where if you suddenly produce an omelet, the whole strength of the company would get up and cheer, led by father. Cancel the omelets, old girl, from now onward.
Yes, dear, but—
Well?
I don't think Mrs. Beale would like that very much, dear. She has been complaining a good deal about chicken at every meal. She says that the omelettes are the only things that give her a chance. She says there are always possibilities in an omelette.
In short, I said, what you propose to do is deliberately to remove from this excellent lady's life the one remaining element of poetry. You mustn't do it. Give Mrs. Beale her omelettes, and let's hope for a larger supply of eggs. Another thing, said Ukridge. It isn't only that there's a shortage of eggs. That wouldn't matter so much if only we kept hatching our fresh squads of chickens. I'm not saying the hens aren't doing their best. I take off my hat to the hens. As nice a hard-working lot as I ever want to meet, full of vigor and earnestness. It's that damned incubator that's letting us down all the time. The rotten thing won't work. I don't know what's the matter with it. The long and the short of it is, it simply declines to incubate.
Perhaps it's your dodge of letting down the temperature. You remember, you were telling me? I forget the details.
My dear old boy, he said earnestly, there's nothing wrong with my figures. It's a mathematical certainty. What's the good of mathematics if not to help you work out that sort of thing? No, there's something deuced wrong with the machine itself, and I shall probably make a complaint to the people I got it from. Where did we get the incubator, old girl?
Harrod's, I think, dear. Yes, it was Harrod's. It came down with the first lot of things.
Then, said Ukridge, banging the table with his fist while his glasses flashed triumph, we've got 'em. The Lord has delivered Harrod's into our hand. Write and answer that letter of theirs tonight, Milly. Sit on them.
Yes, dear.
Tell 'em that we'd have sent them their confounded eggs long ago, if only their rotten two-penny halfpenny incubator had worked with any approach to decency. He paused. Or would you be sarcastic, Garney, old horse? No, better put it so that they'll understand. Say that I consider that the manufacturer of the thing ought to be in Colney Hatch, if he isn't there already, and that they are scoundrels for palming off a groggy machine of that sort on me.
The ceremony of opening the morning's letters at Harrod's ought to be full of interest and excitement tomorrow, I said. This dashing counterstroke seemed to relieve Ukridge. His pessimism vanished. He seldom looked on the dark side of things for long at a time. He began now to speak hopefully of the future. He planned out ingenious improvements. Our fowls were to multiply so rapidly and consistently that within a short space of time Dorsetshire would be paved with them. Our eggs were to increase in size till they broke records and got 3-line notices in the items of interest column in the Daily Mail. Briefly, each hen was to become a happy combination of rabbit and ostrich. There is certainly a good time coming, I said. May it be soon. Meanwhile, what of the local tradesmen? Ukridge relapsed once more into gloom. They are the worst of the lot. I don't mind the London people so much. They only write, and a letter or two hurts nobody. But when it comes to butchers and bakers and grocers and fishmongers and fruiterers and what-not coming up to one's house and dunning one in one's own garden, well, it's a little hard, what? Oh, then those fellows I found you talking to yesterday were duns? I thought they were farmers, come to hear your views on the rearing of poultry. Which were they? Little chap with black whiskers and long, thin man with beard? That was Dawlish the grocer, and Curtis the fishmonger. The others had gone before you came. It may be wondered why, before things came to such a crisis, I had not placed my balance at the bank at the disposal of the senior partner for use on behalf of the farm. The fact was that my balance was at the moment small. I have not yet, in the course of this narrative, gone into my pecuniary position,
but I may state here that it was an inconvenient one. It was big with possibilities, but of ready cash there was but a meagre supply. My parents had been poor, but I had a wealthy uncle. Uncles are notoriously careless of the comfort of their nephews. Mine was no exception. He had views. He was a great believer in matrimony, as, having married 3 wives, not simultaneously, he had every right to be. He was also of opinion that the less money the young bachelor possessed, the better. The consequence was that he announced his intention of giving me a handsome allowance from the day that I married, but not an instant before. Till that glad day I would have to shift for myself. And I am bound to admit that, for an uncle, it was a remarkably sensible idea. I am also of the opinion that it is greatly to my credit, and a proof of my pure and unmercenary nature, that I did not instantly put myself up to be raffled for, or rush out into the streets and propose marriage to the first lady I met. But I was making quite enough with my pen to support myself, and, be it never so humble, there is something pleasant in a bachelor existence. Or so I had thought until very recently. I had thus no great stake in Eucridge's chicken farm. I had contributed a modest £5 to the preliminary expenses, and another 5 after the roup incident. But further I could not go with safety. When his income is dependent on the whims of editors and publishers, the prudent man keeps something up his sleeve against a sudden slump in his particular wares. I did not wish to have to make a hurried choice between matrimony and the workhouse. Having exhausted the subject of finance, or rather, when I began to feel that it was exhausting me, I took my clubs and strolled up the hill to the links to play off a match with a sportsman from the village. I had entered some days previously for a competition for a trophy, I quote the printed notice, presented by a local supporter of the game, in which, up to the present, I was getting on nicely. I had survived 2 rounds, and expected to beat my present opponent, which would bring me into the semi-final. Unless I had bad luck, I felt that I ought to get into the final and win it. As far as I could gather from watching the play of my rivals, the professor was the best of them, and I was convinced that I should have no difficulty with him. But he had the most extraordinary luck at golf, though he never admitted it. He also exercised quite an uncanny influence on his opponent. I have seen men put completely off their stroke by his good fortune. I disposed of my man without difficulty. We parted a little coldly. He had decapitated his brassy on the occasion of his striking Dorsetshire instead of his ball, and he was slow in recovering from the complex emotions which such an episode induces. In the clubhouse I met the professor, whose demeanour was a welcome contrast to that of my late opponent. The professor had just routed his opponent, and so won through to the semi-final. He was warm, but jubilant. I congratulated him and left the place. Phyllis was waiting outside. She often went round the course with him. "Good afternoon," I said. "Have you been round with the professor?" "Yes. We must have been in front of you. Father won his match." "So he was telling me. I was very glad to hear it." "Did you win, Mr. Garnet?" "Yes, pretty easily. My opponent had bad luck all through. Bunkers seemed to have a magnetic attraction for him." "So you and Father are both in the semi-final. I hope you will play very badly." "Thank you," I said. "Yes, it does sound rude, doesn't it? But Father has set his heart on winning this year. Do you know that he has played in the final round 2 years running now?" "Really?" "Both times he was beaten by the same man." "Who was that? Mr. Derrick plays a much better game than anybody I have seen on these links." "It was nobody who is here now. It was a Colonel Jervis. He has not come to Combe Regis this year. That's why Father is hopeful." "Logically," I said, "he ought to be certain to win." "Yes, But you see, you were not playing last year, Mr. Garnet." "Oh, the Professor can make rings round me," I said. "What did you go round in today?" "We were playing match play, and only did the first dozen holes. But my average round is somewhere in the late 80s. The best my father has ever done is 90, and that was only once. So you see, Mr. Garnet, there's going to be another tragedy this year." "You make me feel a perfect brute. But it's more than likely, you must remember, that I shall fail miserably if I ever do play your father in the final. There are days when I play golf as badly as I play tennis. You'll hardly believe me." She smiled reminiscently. "Tom is much too good at tennis. His service is perfectly dreadful." "It's a little terrifying on first acquaintance." "But you're better at golf than at tennis, Mr. Garnet. I wish you were not." "This is a special pleading," I said. "It isn't fair to appeal to my better feelings, Miss Derrick." "I didn't know golfers had any where golf was concerned. Do you really have your off days?" "Nearly always. There are days when I slice with my driver as if it were a bread knife." "Really?" "And when I couldn't putt to hit a haystack." "Then I hope it will be on one of those days that you play father." "I hope so, too," I said. "You hope so?" "Yes." "But don't you want to win?" "I should prefer to please you." "Really? How very unselfish of you, Mr. Garnet," she replied, with a laugh. "I had no idea that such chivalry existed. I thought a golfer would sacrifice anything to win a game." "Most things." "And trample on the feelings of anybody." "Not everybody," I said. At this point, the Professor joined us. Chapter 15. The Arrival of Nemesis. Some people do not believe in presentiments. They attribute that curious feeling that something unpleasant is going to happen to such mundane causes as liver, or a chill, or the weather. For my own part, I think there is more in the matter than the casual observer might imagine. I awoke 3 days after my meeting with the Professor at the clubhouse, filled with a dull foreboding. Somehow I seemed to know that the day was going to turn out badly for me. It may have been liver, or a chill, but it was certainly not the weather. The morning was perfect, the most glorious of a glorious summer. There was a haze over the valley and out to sea which suggested a warm noon, when the sun should have begun the serious duties of the day. The birds were singing in the trees and breakfasting on the lawn, while Edwin, seated on one of the flower beds, watched them with the eye of a connoisseur. Occasionally, when a sparrow hopped in his direction, he would make a sudden spring, and the bird would fly away to the other side of the lawn. I had never seen Edwin catch a sparrow. I believe they looked on him as a bit of a crank, and humored him by coming within springing distance just to keep him amused. Dashing young cock-sparrows would show off before their particular hen-sparrows, and earn a cheap reputation for dare-devilry by going within so many years of Edwin's lair and then darting away. Bob was in his favourite place on the gravel. I took him with me down to the cob to watch me bathe. "What's the matter with me today, Robert, old son?" I asked him as I dried myself. He blinked lazily, but contributed no suggestion. "It's no good looking bored," I went on, "because I'm going to talk about myself, however much it bores you. Here am I, as fit as a prize-fighter, living in the open air for I don't know how long, eating good plain food, bathing every morning, sea-bathing, mind you, and yet what's the result? I feel beastly." Bob yawned and gave a little whine. "Yes," I said, "I know I'm in love, but that can't be it, because I was in love just as much a week ago, and I felt all right then. But isn't she an angel, Bob, isn't she? And didn't you feel bucked when she patted you? Of course you did. Anybody would. But how about Tom Chase? Don't you think he's a dangerous man?
He calls her by her Christian name, you know, and behaves generally as if she belonged to him. And he sees her every day, while I have to trust to meeting her at odd times. And then I generally feel such a fool I can't think of anything to talk about except golf and the weather. He probably sings duets with her after dinner, and you know what comes of duets after dinner." Here Bob, who had been trying for some time to find a decent excuse for getting away, pretended to see something of importance at the other end of the cob, and trotted off to investigate it, leaving me to finish dressing by myself. "Of course," I said to myself, "it may be merely hunger. I may be all right after breakfast. But at present I seem to be working up for a really fine fit of the blues. I feel bad." I whistled to Bob and started for home. On the beach I saw the professor some little distance away, and waved my towel in a friendly manner. He made no reply. Of course, it was possible that he had not seen me, but for some reason his attitude struck me as ominous. As far as I could see, he was looking straight at me, and he was not a short-sighted man. I could think of no reason why he should cut me. We had met on the links on the previous morning, and he had been friendliness itself. He had called me dear boy, supplied me with a gin and ginger beer at the clubhouse, and generally behaved as if he had been David and I Jonathan. Yet in certain moods we are inclined to make mountains out of molehills, and I went on my way, puzzled and uneasy, with a distinct impression that I had received the cut direct. I felt hurt. What had I done that Providence should make things so unpleasant for me? It would be a little hard, as Euclid would have said, if, after all my trouble, the professor had discovered some fresh grievance against me. Perhaps Euclid had been irritating him again. I wished he would not identify me so completely with Euclid. I could not be expected to control the man. Then I reflected that they could hardly have met in the few hours between my parting from the professor at the clubhouse and my meeting with him on the beach. Euclid rarely left the farm. When he was not working among the fowls, he was lying on his back in the paddock, resting his massive mind. I came to the conclusion that after all the professor had not seen me. "I'm an idiot, Bob," I said, as we turned in at the farm gate, and I let my imagination run away with me. Bob wagged his tail in approval of the sentiment. Breakfast was ready when I got in. There was a cold chicken on the sideboard, deviled chicken on the table, a trio of boiled eggs, and a dish of scrambled eggs. As regarded quantity, Mrs. Beale never failed us. Euclid was sorting the letters. "Morning, Garney," he said. "One for you, Milly." "It's from Aunt Elizabeth," said Mrs. Euclid, looking at the envelope. I had only heard casual mention of this relative hitherto, but I had built up a mental picture of her partly from remarks which Euclid had let fall, but principally from the fact that he had named the most malignant hen in our fowl run after her. A severe lady, I imagined, with a cold eye. "Wish she'd enclose a cheque," said Euclid. "She could spare it." "You've no idea, Garney, old man, how disgustingly and indecently rich that woman is. She lives in Kensington on an income which would do her well in Park Lane. But as a touching proposition she had proved almost negligible. She steadfastly refuses to part." "I think she would, dear, if she knew how much we needed it. But I don't like to ask her. She's so curious and says such horrid things." "She does," agreed Euclid gloomily. He spoke as one who had had experience. "2 for you, Garney. All the rest for me. 10 of them, and all bills." He spread the envelopes out on a table, and drew one at a venture. "Whiteley's," he said, "getting jumpy. Are in receipt of my favour of the 7th instant, and are at a loss to understand it. It's rummy about these blighters, but they never seem able to understand a damn thing. It's hard.
You put things in words of one syllable for them, and they just goggle and wonder what it all means. They want something on account. Upon my Sam, I'm disappointed with Whiteleys. I'd been thinking in rather a kindly spirit of them, and feeling that they were a more intelligent lot than Harrods. I'd half a mind to give Harrods the miss in baulk and hand my whole trade over to these fellows. But not now, dash it! Whiteleys have disappointed me. From the way they write, you'd think they thought I was doing it all for fun. How can I let them have their infernal money when there isn't any? Here's one from Dorchester. Smith, the chap we got the gramophone from, wants to know when I'm going to settle up for 16 records. Sordid brute! I wanted to get on with my own correspondence, but Eucridge held me with a glittering eye. The chicken men, the dealer people, you know, want me to pay for the first lot of hens. Considering that they all died of roup, and that I was going to send them back anyhow after I'd got them to hatch out a few chickens, I call that cool. I mean to say, business is business, but that's what these fellows don't seem to understand. I can't afford to pay enormous sums for birds which die off quicker than I can get them in.
I shall never speak to Aunt Elizabeth again, said Mrs. Eucridge suddenly. She had dropped the letter she had been reading and was staring indignantly in front of her. There were 2 little red spots on her cheeks.
"What's the matter, old chap?" inquired Eucridge affectionately, glancing up from his pile of bills and forgetting his own troubles in an instant. "Buck up. Aunt Elizabeth been getting on your nerves again? What's she been saying this time?"
Mrs. Eucridge left the room with a sob. Eucridge sprang at the letter.
"If that demon doesn't stop writing her infernal letters and upsetting Milly, I shall strangle her with my bare hands, regardless of her age and sex."
He turned over the pages of the letter till he came to the passage which had caused the trouble.
"Well, upon my Sam, listen to this, Garney, old horse. You tell me nothing regarding the success of this chicken farm of yours, and I confess that I find your silence ominous. You know my opinion of your husband. He is perfectly helpless in any matter requiring the exercise of a little common sense and business capability." He stared at me, amazed. "I like that. 'Pon my soul, this is really rich. I could have believed almost anything of that blighted female, but I did think she had a reasonable amount of intelligence. Why, you know that it's just in matters requiring common sense and business capability that I come out really strong."
"Of course, old man," I replied dutifully. "The woman's a fool."
"That's what she calls me 2 lines further on. No wonder Milly was upset. Why can't these cats leave people alone?"
"Oh, woman, woman," I threw in helpfully.
"Always interfering. Rotten. And backbiting. Awful. I shan't stand it. I shouldn't. Look here, on the next page she calls me a gaby."
"It's time you took a strong line."
"And in the very next sentence refers to me as a perfect guffin." "What's a guffin, Garney, old boy?"
I considered the point. "Broadly speaking, I should say one who guffs."
"I believe it's actionable."
"I shouldn't wonder." Eucridge rushed to the door.
"Milly!"
He slammed the door, and I heard him dashing upstairs. I turned to my letters. One was from Lickford, with a Cornish postmark. I glanced through it and laid it aside for a more exhaustive perusal. The other was in a strange handwriting. I looked at the signature. Patrick Derrick. This was queer. What had the professor to say to me? The next moment, my heart seemed to spring to my throat. "Sir," the letter began. A pleasant, cheery opening. Then it got off the mark, so to speak, like lightning. There was no sparring for an opening, no dignified parade of set phrases leading up to the main point. It was the letter of a man who was almost too furious to write. It gave me the impression that if he had not written it, he would have been obliged to have taken some very violent form of exercise by way of relief to his soul. You will be good enough to look on our acquaintance as closed. I have no wish to associate with persons of your stamp. If we should happen to meet, you will be good enough to treat me as a total stranger, as I shall treat you. And, if I might be allowed to give you a word of advice, I should recommend you in future, when you wish to exercise your humour, to do so in some less practical manner than by bribing boatmen to upset your friends, crossed out thickly, and acquaintances substituted. If you require further enlightenment in this matter, the enclosed letter may be of service to you. With which he remained mine faithfully, Patrick Derrick. The enclosed letter was from one Jane Musprat. It was bright and interesting. Dear Sir, my Harry, Mr. Hawke, says to me how it was him upsetting the boat and you, not because he is not steady in a boat, which he is no man more so in Combe Regis, but because one of the gentlemen what keeps chickens up the hill, the little one, Mr. Garnick his name is, says to him, Hawke, I'll give you a sovereign to upset Mr. Derrick in your boat. And my Harry, being easily led, was took in and did. But he's sorry now, and wishes he hadn't, and says he'll never do a practical joke again for anyone, even for a banknote. Yours obediently, Jane Musprat. Oh, woman, woman. At the bottom of everything, history is full of tragedies caused by the lethal sex. Who cost Mark Antony the world? A woman. Who let Samson in so atrociously? Woman again. Why did Bill Bailey leave home? Once more, because of a woman. And here was I, Jerry Garnett, harmless, well-meaning writer of minor novels, going through the same old mill. I cursed Jane Musprat. What chance had I with Phyllis now? Could I hope to win over the professor again? I cursed Jane Musprat for the second time. My thoughts wandered to Mr. Harry Hawke. The villain, the scoundrel! What business had he to betray me? Well, I could settle with him. The man who lays a hand upon a woman, save in the way of kindness, is justly disliked by society. So the woman Musprat, culpable as she was safe from me. But what of the man Hawke? There no such consideration swayed me. I would interview the man Hawke. I would give him the most hectic 10 minutes of his career. I would say things to him the recollection of which would make him start up shrieking in his bed in the small hours of the night. I would arise and be a man and slay him. Take him grossly, full of bread, with all his crimes broad blown, as flush as May, at gaming, swearing, or about some act that had no relish of salvation in it. The demon! My life ruined. My future grey and black. My heart shattered. And why? Because of the scoundrel Hawke. Phyllis would meet me in the village, on the cob, on the links, and pass by as if I were the invisible man. And why? Because of the reptile Hawke, the worm Hawke, the dastard and varlet Hawke. I crammed my hat on and hurried out of the house towards the village. Chapter 16. A Chance Meeting. I roamed the place in search of the varlet for the space of half an hour, and, after having drawn all his familiar haunts, found him at length leaning over the sea-wall near the church, gazing thoughtfully into the waters below. I confronted him. "Well," I said, "you're a beauty, aren't you?" He eyed me owlishly. Even at this early hour I was grieved to see he showed signs of having looked on the bitter while it was brown. His eyes were filmy, and his manner aggressively solemn. "Beauty?" he echoed. What have you got to say for yourself?" "Say for self." It was plain that he was engaged in pulling his faculties together by some laborious process known only to himself. At present, my words conveyed no meaning to him. He was trying to identify me. He had seen me before somewhere, he was certain, but he could not say where or who I was. "I want to know," I said, "what induced you to be such an abject idiot as to let our arrangements get known." I spoke quietly. I was not going to waste the choicer flowers of speech on a man who was incapable of understanding them. Later on, when he had awakened to a sense of his position, I would begin really to talk to him. He continued to stare at me. Then a sudden flash of intelligence lit up his features. "Mr. Garnick," he said at last. "From Chicken Farm," he continued, with the triumphant air of a cross-examining king's counsel who has at last got on the track. "Yes," I said. "Up top the hill," he proceeded, clinchingly. He stretched out a huge hand. "How you?" he inquired with a friendly grin. "I want to know," I said distinctly, "what you've got to say for yourself after letting our affair with the professor become public property." He paused a while in thought. "Dear sir," he said at last, as if he were dictating a letter, "Dear sir, I owe you He waved his hand as who should say, "It's a stiff job, but I'm going to do it." "Explation," he said. "You do," I said grimly. "I should like to hear it." "Dear sir, listen me." "Go on, then." "You came me. You said, 'Hawk, old friend, listen me. You tip this old bufflehead into water,' you said, 'and gormed if I don't give 'ee a pound note.' That's what you said me. Isn't that what you said me?" I did not deny it. Well, I said you. Right, I said. I tipped the old soul into water, and got the pound note. Yes, you took care of that. All this is quite true. But it's beside the point. We're not disputing about what happened. What I want to know, for the third time, is what made you let the cat out of the bag. Why couldn't you keep quiet about it?" He waved his hand. "Dear sir," he replied, "this way. Listen me." It was a tragic story that he unfolded. My wrath ebbed as I listened. After all, the fellow was not so greatly to blame. I felt that in his place I should have acted as he had done. It was fate's fault, and fate's alone. It appeared that he had not come well out of the matter of the accident. I had not looked at it hitherto from his point of view. While the rescue had left me the popular hero, it had had quite the opposite result for him. He had upset his boat and would have drowned his passenger, said public opinion, if the young hero from London, myself, had not plunged in and at the risk of his life brought the professor ashore. Consequently, he was despised by all as an inefficient boatman. He became a laughing-stock. The local wags made laborious jests when he passed. They offered him fabulous sums to take their worst enemies out for a row with him. They wanted to know when he was going to school to learn his business. In fact, they behaved as wags do and always have done at all times all over the world. Now, all this, it seemed, Mr. Hawk would have borne cheerfully and patiently for my sake, or, at any rate, for the sake of my crisp pound note I had given him, but a fresh factor appeared in the problem, complicating it grievously. To wit, Miss Jane Musprat. "She said to me," explained Mr. Hawk with pathos, "'Harry Hawk,' she said,
"You'm a girt fool, and I don't marry no one as ain't to be trusted in a boat by hisself, and what has jokes made about him by that Tom Lee." "I punch Tom Lee," observed Mr. Hawk parenthetically. "So," she said me, "you can go away, and I don't want to see you again." This heartless conduct on the part of Miss Musprat had had the natural result of making him confess in self-defense, and she had written to the Professor the same night. I forgave Mr. Hawk. I think he was hardly sober enough to understand, for he betrayed no emotion. "It is fate, Hawk," I said, "simply fate. There is a divinity that shapes our ends, rough-hew them how we will, and it's no good grumbling." "Yes," said Mr. Hawk, after chewing this sentiment for a while in silence. "So she said me, 'Hawk,' she said like that, 'you're a girt fool.'" "That's all right," I replied. "I quite understand. As I say, it's simply fate. Goodbye," and I left him. As I was going back, I met the Professor and Phyllis. They passed me without a look. I wandered on in quite a fervour of self-pity. I was in one of those moods when life suddenly seems to become irksome, when the future stretches black and grey in front of me. I should have liked to have faded almost imperceptibly from the world, like Mr. Bardell, even if, as in his case, it had involved being knocked on the head with a pint pot in a public-house cellar. In such a mood it is imperative that one should seek distraction. The shining example of Mr. Harry Hawk did not lure me. Taking to drink would be a nuisance. Work was what I wanted. I would toil like a navvy all day among the fowls, separating them when they fought, gathering in the eggs when they laid, chasing them across country when they got away, and even, if necessity arose, painting their throats with turpentine when they were stricken with roup. Then, after dinner, when the lamps were lit, and Mrs. Eucridge nursed Edwin and sewed, and Eucridge smoked cigars and incited the gramophone to murder mumbling mows, I would steal away to my bedroom and write, and write, and write, and go on writing till my fingers were numb and my eyes refused to do their duty. And when time had passed, I might come to feel that it was all for the best. A man must go through the fire before he can write his masterpiece. We learn in suffering what we teach in song. What we lose on the swings we make up on the roundabouts. Jerry Garnett, the man, might become a depressed, hopeless wreck, with the iron planted immovably in his soul, but Jeremy Garnett, the author, should turn out such a novel of gloom that strong critics would weep, and the public jostle for copies till Muty's doorway became a shambles. Thus might I some day feel that all this anguish was really a blessing, effectively disguised. But I doubted it. We were none of us very cheerful now at the farm. Even Eucridge's spirit was a little daunted by the bills which poured in by every post. It was as if the tradesmen of the neighbourhood had formed a league, and were working it in concert. Or it may have been due to thought waves. Little accounts came not in single spies, but in battalions. The popular demand for the sight of the colour of his money grew daily. Every morning at breakfast he would give us fresh bulletins of the state of mind of each of our creditors, and thrill us with the announcement that Whiteley's was getting cross and Harrod's jumpy, or that the bearings of Dawlish the grocer were becoming overheated. We lived in a continual atmosphere of worry. Chicken and nothing but chicken at meals, and chicken and nothing but chicken between meals had frayed our nerves. An air of defeat hung over the place. We were a beaten side, and we realized it. We had been playing an uphill game for nearly 2 months, and the strain was beginning to tell. Eucridge became uncannily silent. Mrs. Eucridge, though she did not understand, I fancy, the details of the matter, was worried because Eucridge was. Mrs. Beale had long since been turned into a soured cynic by the lack of chances vouchsafed her for the exercise of her art. And as for me, I have never since spent so profoundly miserably a week. I was not even permitted the anodyne of work. There seemed to be nothing to do on the farm. The chickens were quite happy, and only asked to be let alone and allowed to have their meals at regular intervals. And every day one or more of their number would vanish into the kitchen. Mrs. Beale would serve up the corpse in some cunning disguise, and we would try to delude ourselves into the idea that it was something altogether different. There was one solitary gleam of variety in our menu. An editor sent me a cheque for a set of verses. We cashed that cheque and trooped round the town in a body, laying out the money. We bought a leg of mutton and a tongue and sardines and pineapple chunks and potted meat and many other noble things, and had a perfect banquet. Mrs. Beale, with the scenario of a smile on her face, the first that she had worn in these days of stress, brought in the joint and uncovered it with an air. "Thank God," said Eucridge as he began to carve. It was the first time I had ever heard him say a grace, and if ever an occasion merited such a deviation from habit, this occasion did. After that, we relapsed into routine again. Deprived of physical labor, with the exception of golf and bathing, trivial sports compared with work in the fowl run at its hardest, I tried to make up for it by working at my novel. It refused to materialize. The only progress I achieved was with my villain. I drew him from the professor, and made him a blackmailer. He had several other social defects, but that was his profession. That was the thing he did really well. It was on one of the many occasions on which I had sat in my room, pen in hand, through the whole of a lovely afternoon, with no better result than a slight headache, that I bethought me of that little paradise on the Wear Cliff, hung over the sea and backed by green woods. I had not been there for some time, owing principally to an entirely erroneous idea that I could do more solid work sitting in a straight hard chair at a table than lying on soft turf with the sea wind in my eyes. But now the desire to visit that little clearing again drove me from my room. In the drawing-room below, the gramophone was dealing brassily with Mr. Blackman. Outside, the sun was just thinking of setting. The Wear Cliff was the best medicine for me. What does Kipling say? "And soon you will find that the sun and the wind, and the gin of the garden too, have lightened the hump, Camellias hump, the hump that is black and blue." His instructions include digging with a hoe and a shovel also, but I could omit that. The sun and the wind were what I needed. I took the upper road. In certain moods I preferred it to the path along the cliff. I walked fast. The exercise was soothing. To reach my favorite clearing, I had to take to the fields on the left, and strike downhill in the direction of the sea. I hurried down the narrow path. I broke into the clearing at a jog trot and stood panting. And, at the same moment, looking cool and beautiful in her white dress, Phyllis entered in from the other side. Phyllis, without the professor.